I never asked to be born. This is what my parents, Robert and Linda Parker, made crystal clear from day one. I am Cindy, an unwanted second child, a random thought, a mistaken touch on their perfectly constructed picture of life. My older sister, Melissa, was their golden child, the very ideal they were so eager to create. She was the one they planned to raise in Parker, a model daughter with impeccable behavior and noble aspirations. She was their future, and I was a mistake. Housekeeping in our house was like living in two different worlds. Melissa lived in her own world, a world of love, attention, celebration, and adoration. Her every step, every word was important, meaningful. My world was different, cold, empty, full of indifference and barely concealed resentment. I always felt superfluous, as if my existence was not something valuable or necessary. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was just a shadow against the bright light of my sister. I remember my 8th birthday as if it was yesterday. I woke up early in the morning, excited, full of hope. I was hoping that this year everything would be different. Maybe they'll finally notice me. Maybe they will care. But, as always, I was wrong. I went downstairs, and Mom and Dad were sitting in the kitchen, engrossed in conversation with Melissa, discussing her upcoming dance concert. They talked about her successes, about the clothes for the performance, about all the details. I stood at the door, feeling out of place in my own house, trying to hide my disappointment. When I said, "Happy birthday," with difficulty, my mother looked up, as if she had just remembered that I existed. "Oh, Cindy, your cereal is in the closet," she said, returning to the conversation with Melissa. That was all I got on my day. No hugs, no celebration, no words. Just cold invisibility. In the evening, when we sat down to dinner, Dad finally noticed my day. He muttered, "Oh, yeah, right, happy birthday, baby," without looking up from his plate. Mom only widened her eyes slightly, as if she realized something, but she didn't show the slightest interest either. It was such a moment, such a small, insignificant gesture, that I could have sworn they were sure that my birthday was not today, but next week. That night, I was lying in my bed, hugging my pillow, clutching the only greeting card I had received. It was a postcard from Elizabeth's grandmother. She was always the one figure who gave me the feeling that I meant something. Her words were my only hope. "My dear Cindy, happy birthday, darling, you bring so much joy into my life. Never forget how special and beloved you are. Always love, Grandma." These words were like a ray of light in a dark room. I reread them 100 times, trying to believe in them, in their truthfulness, but how could I believe that I was really special when my own parents could barely remember my existence? School wasn't a salvation for me either. I didn't participate in teacher conferences because they didn't make sense to me. I watched how the parents of other children were proud of their children's achievements and supported them. My parents always found excuses. "Sorry, Cindy's mom," my mom would say, as if that was the most important thing. "We have Melissa's dance competition today." And I, nodding, pretended that everything was fine. But it wasn't like that. Every time I heard them talking about me, when I thought they didn't notice me, I felt like I was disappearing, like I was becoming invisible. One night I was supposedly lying in my bed, trying to pretend to be asleep, but their voices, unaware of my presence, penetrated through the cracks of the night silence and went up the stairs. I froze in the dark, clutching the blanket, and I could almost feel their words penetrating into me, into my heart, into my very heart. It was like the tip of a knife, stabbing slowly and precisely, without giving the slightest chance of relief. "I just don't understand," Dad was saying, his voice restrained but inexpressibly full of disappointment. "Melissa is so smart and talented. Why can't Cindy be more like her mom?" I pressed my cheeks against the pillow, trying not to make a sound, even when his voice became quieter, but palpable from the pain. He continued without noticing me, "Cindy's not even trying. Do you remember how Melissa read when she was 4? And Cindy can barely tie her shoelaces at that age." I could feel his every breath piercing through me, as if his words were stones flying towards me. I was too young to understand that their words were not just criticism, it was dislike, which they did not try to hide. It seemed to me that I could never be good enough to earn their love or even their attention. This thought accompanied me every day, like a shadow that was always behind me. I learned to be quiet, withdrawn, not stand out, because everything I did seemed insufficient to them. And the older I got, the more I felt the gap between us growing. I began to close myself in my inner world, because in reality, in their world, I had no place. But there was at least one person in this darkness who really saw me. Elizabeth's grandmother. Every visit to her little house was like breathing in fresh air in a suffocating world. In her house, I could be myself, without fear of being judged or rejected. She was the one who loved me just for being me, and her warmth was my only salvation. Grandma never made me feel like a stranger. Her words, her look, everything was filled with meaning. I wasn't just Cindy here, I was important. I was a daughter who was loved. When I was 12, I finally reached my limit. The atmosphere of the house, full of fear and dissatisfaction, became unbearable. I couldn't breathe anymore. I felt that if I didn't take a step, if I didn't change anything, I risked just disappearing, losing myself forever. Then I decided that I had to ask my grandmother for something that I could never ask my parents. With tears in my eyes, I went up to my grandmother, who, as always, was sitting in her chair, knitting something warm and cozy. I could barely utter the words, "Grandma, can I live with you?" I gasped, barely holding back my sobs. My heart was racing with fear that she would say no, that I would be rejected again. But her response was instant and full of warmth. "Oh, honey," she said, picking me up in her arms and hugging me tightly. "You always have a home with me, and one day everything I have will be yours." I melted into her arms, feeling real security for the first time in a long time. At that moment, I realized that I was important, that I deserved love and care. I didn't think about the inheritance, I didn't worry about what she would leave me someday. The only important thing was that she loved me, and that was enough. When my parents found out about my decision, their reaction was exactly what I expected. Mom laughed, Dad scoffed, saying that Grandma lives in some tiny old house where she works in the library for pennies. "What can she offer you, Cindy?" he asked. Mom shrugged, clearly relieved that I was gone. "Okay," she said without hesitation. "It will make the situation here easier." They didn't understand what Grandma could offer me. She couldn't offer me luxury or status, but she could give me what I was looking for, love and acceptance. And that was enough. Everything changed on a clear autumn day when Grandma returned home with an expression on her face that I had never seen before. It was an overwhelming mix of joy and sadness, laughter and tears, emotions that overwhelmed her so much that she could barely stand on her feet. I was sitting in the living room when she came in, and I immediately noticed how unusual she looked. There was a sparkle in her eyes, and her lips were trembling, as if she was about to reveal a secret that would change everything. "Cindy, my love," she began, and I saw her voice tremble. "We need to talk." I felt something tighten in my chest and looked at my grandmother with concern. She stopped, looked into my eyes, and I realized that it was serious. "It's about your Aunt Margaret," Grandma said, trying to speak calmly, but I noticed her shoulders tremble slightly. I vaguely remembered hearing about Aunt Margaret, a wealthy businesswoman who had lived apart from her family for many years. She was a mystery to all of us, often staying out of sight, preferring to stay at a distance. We hardly talked to her. "She died unexpectedly," Grandma continued, and her words hung in the air like a heavy, invisible weight. I felt uneasy, and I reached for her hand, trying to convey at least a little comfort. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but Grandma just squeezed my hand, as if this little support was more important to her than anything in the world. She paused, as if about to say something important. "And finally," she said, "Margaret left me her entire fortune." I was almost speechless. Millions. We had become multimillionaires. It was like a bolt from the blue, incredible and overwhelming. When the news of my grandmother's good fortune spread through the city, my parents did not take long to wait. They appeared in our house just in the evening, when I was sitting with my grandmother in the kitchen. They knocked on the door and entered, smiling and with tear-filled eyes. Mom was the first to speak, and her voice, choked with emotion, sounded like I'd never heard it before. "Elizabeth, Cindy." And she stopped, as if she couldn't find the right words. "We made a terrible mistake." Dad stood by, nodding and looking more humble than ever. He added that we were terrible parents, that they realized their mistakes and now they want to fix everything. I stayed standing. My cold heart couldn't digest what I was hearing. These people who had ignored me for years, humiliated me, now stood in front of me and begged me to give them a second chance. Mom begged me to come home, said that everything would be different now, that we would be the family we should have been from the very beginning. I looked around at my grandmother, looking for an answer, support. She looked at me with a soft smile and said softly, "It's your decision, dear. Whatever you choose, I will be with you." And at that moment, I felt like all my strength was gone. Days filled with agonizing reflections were enough for me to make a decision. With Grandma's help, I packed my bags and returned to Parker House. At first glance, it looked like a dream come true. Mom and Dad had become more attentive, caring, even sincere. They attended my every school event, applauded the loudest, as if I were their only joy. They bought me gifts, not expensive, but thoughtful, and it meant more than words could express. They started paying attention to me. Family game nights have become the norm in our home. I remember the first time Dad ruffled my hair after I won Monopoly, saying, "That's my girl." I felt a sudden and gentle warmth envelop me. But most importantly, I finally felt like I was there. What I mean to someone. And it was incredible. I called my grandmother regularly, telling her how happy I was, how wonderful everything was going. She was always happy for me, proud of my success, but despite this, I couldn't help but notice that there was concern in her voice at times. She didn't leave me a single opportunity to forget that I could always come back to her. "Remember, Cindy," she said, "you always have a home with me, no matter what's going on around you." These words became not just a consolation for me, but a kind of anchor that held me at a time when the whole world around me began to seem so fickle. Life in the Parker family gradually entered a new rhythm. Melissa, that golden child, was still the star of the family. She graduated from high school with honors, went to a prestigious college, and everyone in the house revolved around her like planets around the sun. Meanwhile, Grandma moved into a luxurious new house, saying goodbye to my memories of her cozy, old library, in which I once found my only world. At the age of 16, I felt that a lot of things were starting to change. My grades became better than ever, and I began to feel that my inner world was filling with meaning. I got a good company, several loyal friends with whom I shared my joys and worries. And so, in chemistry class, I met Jake. He was funny, attentive, and had already asked me out on a date. It was Friday night, and I was preparing to meet him like never before. I stood in front of the mirror for hours, choosing an outfit, redoing makeup, nervously glancing at my watch. I was looking forward to our meeting at the local diner, where we were supposed to spend time together. I felt over the moon with happiness, and despite my inner worries, I believed that this evening would be special. But when I was sitting in the diner waiting for Jake, my phone vibrated and I got a message. "Sorry, Cindy, something came, I can't come tonight." My heart sank, and I involuntarily stared at the screen. Disappointment washed over me like a cold wave. I took a deep breath and gathered my strength, deciding that I would not sit and waste time. My meeting didn't take place, and I couldn't change that. I left the diner much earlier than I had planned and headed home, feeling the emptiness growing inside with every step. The house was quiet when I entered, using the key so as not to wake anyone. Mom and Dad seemed to think that I was still on a date, and I, tired and exhausted, felt neither the strength nor the desire to explain why I returned so early. As I passed my dad's office, I heard voices. I was about to announce my presence when Mom uttered words that made me stop. She spoke with such disappointment, with such tired despair, that I couldn't believe my ears. "I do not know how long I can continue this charade," my mother said, and there was something in her voice that I could not understand. Pretend to love her, it's become exhausting. I froze in place, and something inside me clenched. Pretend to love me? Those words were like a knife in my heart. They cut me, and I couldn't get rid of them. But what Dad said made my blood run cold. We need to be patient, dear, he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and he didn't seem to want me to hear, but I couldn't help but eavesdrop. As soon as Mom gives up, all this money will go to Cindy. If we play our cards right, we can convince her to share her wealth with us. Just think. The Pope added that his tone was filled with false concern, and the faint smile he was trying to portray did not hide what was really happening. His voice was shaking when he talked about Jake canceling the date. I muttered, watching their faces carefully, and suddenly something in their reactions seemed strangely familiar to me, as if this scene had already been played out before, and they were just repeating their roles by rote. It was too perfect. Too much. Sympathetically. Mom continued to cackle like a soothing bird chirping, and Dad touched my shoulder as if I needed comfort. I barely restrained myself from flinching at their touch that night. I lay in bed all night, unable to sleep, their words echoing in my head. I couldn't understand why their concern had suddenly become so intrusive, as if I had become some kind of part of their carefully constructed game. And despite all their worries, I knew something was wrong. In the morning, as soon as I heard both cars pull away from the driveway, I knew it was time to act. I quickly packed my things, not allowing myself to look back, stuffing clothes and souvenirs into a gym bag, as if it were something that should not be left in this house, which has never really been my home. I left him, holding back tears with difficulty, and went to my grandmother. When I appeared on her doorstep with bags in my hands, her eyes widened in shock. "Cindy, what's wrong, honey?" She almost couldn't believe her eyes. I burst into tears, and the tears finally broke, pouring out all the pain and anger that I had been holding in for a long time. Between sobs, I managed to pull out my phone and turn on the recording, the very conversation I overheard last night. My grandmother's face changed at first, as if she was trying to comprehend what was happening, then shock changed on her face, and finally I saw something I had never expected, rage, which I had not noticed in her before. These insidious, heartless. She began to cut herself, sighing and taking a pause. I was silent, clutching the phone in my hands. At that moment it seemed to me that time had slowed down, and all these years when I was deprived of love, pain, and attention suddenly exploded in my mind. Grandma took a deep breath, her eyes softened, and she looked at me with such confidence that I had never felt before. "Don't worry, dear," she said, "we'll surprise them. They won't forget." Grandma hugged me tightly, and I felt everything that had been up to that moment dissolve into her warmth. I finally felt safe, as if the walls of this house had suddenly become real, and that was all I was missing. When evening came, the phone began to buzz incessantly. Mom, Dad, even Melissa, they all called, leaving voicemails, sending messages. I ignored them all until I finally felt like I couldn't take their annoying attention anymore. "Hi," I replied, not hiding the coldness in my voice. The mom on the other end of the line immediately trembled. "Cindy, oh, thank God, where are you? We were so worried." I almost laughed at the irony of her words. It was so pathetic and unnatural. "I'm with my grandmother," I replied calmly. "And we would like to invite you all to a family conversation tomorrow." There was a pause on the other side. At first, she was completely confused, then hesitantly, as if she had not yet decided exactly what to say. "Of course I will be there, Cindy, dear. Whatever happens, we can fix it all." I hung up the phone before she could finish, feeling like all her words remained unfinished, as if she didn't understand that behind all this was not just a desire to fix, but something much deeper. My parents entered the mansion with expressions I didn't expect to see. When it was over, there was a deafening silence. There was a thick, almost tangible moment of waiting in the air before they finally started talking. Their words merged into a jumble of excuses and apologies that seemed completely empty in the face of their exposed deception. Every word they tried to squeeze out sounded like an attempt to hide the truth, and at some point it became obvious that nothing they said could bring back the illusion of a family that they had so cleverly tried to create. Grandma raised her hand, and her gesture was so decisive that the air seemed to shrink around us. Everything went quiet. When she spoke, her voice was shaking with a mixture of disappointment and barely contained rage. I stood next to her, feeling her every word penetrate me, giving me strength. "I was hoping that I really believed that you had changed," Grandma said, holding back her anger and bitterness at the same time. "Every word I've said to you before has been heavy with emotion. I even thought about dividing my property among all of you." She stopped, her gaze steely. "But now I can say with absolute certainty that everything I have will go to Cindy alone." Her words cut through the air, and I felt something inside me weaken. It was not liberation, but a deep understanding that I no longer need to look for my value in other people's eyes. My parents stood in silence, but I saw how the realization that they had lost not only their plan, but also the real opportunity to become part of a rich family, immediately struck them. Panic set in. Their reaction started from one extreme to the other. "Please, you have to understand," Mom pleaded, her voice full of tears. "We made a mistake, but we love Cindy. We can fix everything." When their requests went unanswered, their tone changed rapidly. Dad's face contorted with anger, and his words came out like a growl. "You can't do this. We are her parents, we have rights. We will make sure that you never see her again, Elizabeth." Their threats overwhelmed me, but for the first time in my life I felt a strange confidence that had not been there before. I knew that here, in this moment, I could do something important for myself. I knew exactly where I was and what I needed to do. "I'm applying for emancipation," I said, and my voice was even and clear. "Grandma will be my legal guardian. You don't have any power over me anymore." The shock on their faces would have been almost comical if the situation hadn't been so tragic. I felt the pain inside me finally begin to subside. They were looking for me, they tried to manipulate me, but all their carefully thought-out plans failed. And I knew that everything would be different now. "I think it's time for you to leave," Grandma said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She stood up and pointed to the door, and when they left the house with pale faces, I took a deep breath. The door closed behind them, and I couldn't believe it was finally over. I felt the tension of the last few days begin to melt away, as if I had just been able to exhale after being underwater for a long time. Grandma came over and hugged me tightly. This moment was important. It wasn't easy, but it was my moment. The weeks after the confrontation with his parents were a storm. Legal meetings, hundreds of documents, endless signing of papers, all this consumed us. Grandma hired a team of the best lawyers to help us figure out the complicated process. She and I shared this path, and even though it was hard, I felt like I was getting stronger with every step. Mrs. Johnson, my third-grade teacher, once told me how proud she was of my achievements. She especially remembered the moment when I won the spelling bee and my parents didn't even come to the award ceremony. Those words she uttered have always remained in my memory like an incurable pain. But what was much more painful was that, despite all these successes, they never noticed me, did not recognize that I was more than just a duty or part of the family routine. Melissa has always been on a pedestal, always been the chosen one. The neighbors also noticed a difference in how I was treated and how my sister was treated. It was said that I was in the shadows, and Melissa was in the light. Mr. Rivera, an old neighbor, recalled how I always stayed away while her birthdays were real events. Melissa and I were like heaven and earth. She is always the center of attention, and I am somewhere on the periphery. And when it sounded again in the courtroom, I felt like my whole life had passed before my eyes. On the day of the last hearing, as we were sitting in the courtroom waiting for the judge to arrive, I noticed a familiar face that slipped through the back door. It was Melissa. She wasn't the girl I grew up with. There was no previous sisterly love in her eyes, only a cold determination. She sat down in her seat, and her words destroyed all remaining illusions about family affection. "Yes, Your Honor," her voice was firm, but I detected a cold detachment in it. I knew about my parents' plan. They wanted to use Cindy to get to my grandmother's money. The courtroom was filled with murmurs, like a wave that covers everything. I sat stunned, trying to make sense of what she had said. Melissa continued her game, wrapping everything up in a package of sisterhood bonds. She explained how all her kind words and actions were part of an elaborate plan to convince me of their sincerity. When her gaze met mine, I saw a glimmer of remorse in its depths. But it was too late. This betrayal was the final nail in the coffin of my relationship with the Parkers. When the judge's decision was made, it was swift and unambiguous. Elizabeth was given full custody, and I was legally released from Robert and Linda Parker. The judge left no room for doubt. It was not just liberation from the power of my parents, it was liberation from the whole life that I once considered my own. When we left the courthouse, I was overcome by a strange mixture of emotions. I felt relieved, but at the same time I was tormented by sadness, as if I was saying goodbye to something important. But most of all, I felt free. Freedom from manipulation, from that fake love that tried to impose its model of the world on me. Grandma put her arm around my shoulders and pulled me closer, as if protecting me from everything that was left behind. "It's over, honey," she said softly, "you're safe now." I nodded, unable to speak through the lump in my throat. That was all. Yes, it was over. But at this end, I felt the beginning. The beginning of a new life, without lies, without cunning manipulations, without hidden expectations. I was moving towards a future built on sincere love, respect, and acceptance. As we drove home, I looked out the window, watching the familiar streets of my childhood rush by. They were no longer the roads for me that led home to a place where I felt unimportant. Now I was leaving behind the family I was born into, but I was heading towards something much more valuable. It was a future in which I could be myself, in which I was accepted. When the dust settled from the legal battles and emotional turmoil, I found myself standing on a new beginning. Grandma Elizabeth, true to her word, devoted herself to giving me all the opportunities she could, but more than material comforts or expensive tutors, it was her unwavering support and love that was crucial. She often told me, "You can be anyone you want, be Cindy." Her eyes shone with pride, and I felt that the world was really open to me. Together we went on adventures that I had never dared to imagine. Paris, with its majestic architecture and art, was a revelation to me. There I fell in love with painting and sculpture, plunging headlong into the history of every museum, every gallery. We traveled to Africa, where I discovered wildlife photography, learning to see the world in the smallest detail. These trips are not only exotic, not only new countries and continents. These were adventures that allowed me to get to know myself, to discover talents and desires in myself that I didn't even know about. But trips and new experiences were only part of my journey. The real work took place in the quiet office of Dr. Eason, my therapist, twice a week. I sat on her comfortable couch and, step by step, unpacked the years of emotional trauma. She taught me that it's okay to be angry, that you can grieve for the family you should have had. All this was in the process of acceptance, in the recognition of pain, and despite this, I gradually learned to trust not only others, but also myself. I began to realize that I deserve love and respect just for who I am. When I graduated from high school, I suddenly realized how much I had gone through over the years. I'd been thinking about the tumultuous journey that brought me here to this moment. My biological family left my life, and there were no more calls, no postcards, no contact. Mom, Dad, Melissa, now they were just characters in a painful chapter of my past. And maybe it was the best thing that could have happened to me. At some point, I realized that by losing them, I had gained something much more valuable: self-respect, inner strength, and the unconditional love of my grandmother, who became a greater parent for me than my biological parents ever were. The night before graduation, when Grandma and I were sitting on the patio, enjoying the silence and watching the sunset paint the sky in bright shades of orange and pink, Grandma said, "I'm so proud of you, Cindy. You've overcome so much. Look at you, you're stronger and more beautiful now than ever." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. But this time it was tears of joy. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma." She shook her head, her smile was soft and warm. No, dear, you save yourself. I just gave you a safe place to do it. And at that moment, I realized that Grandma was not just a support, but also a teacher of life. She not only gave me the opportunity to become who I am, but also taught me how to be strong, independent, and happy. I was ready for new steps, for new challenges. My life began here and now, in this wonderful moment when I could truly feel alive.